"You don't understand," he said, voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never thought I would hear those words come from his mouth. I had imagined a million different ways this would end, had rehearsed all the possible betrayals in my head late at night when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, pretending that the ache in my chest was something I could ignore. But somehow, nothing had ever prepared me for the way it actually felt. There was no explosion, no wave of anger, no outburst of tears. Just silence. A suffocating, hollow silence that wrapped itself around me, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab something and throw it, watch it shatter, just to see something break the way I felt broken inside. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I just stood there, staring at him, watching his face twist into something desperate, something pleading, something that might have worked on me before. He wanted me to believe him. He wanted me to forgive. And for years, I had. For years, I had stitched up every wound he left on this relationship, convinced myself that love meant patience, that loyalty meant sacrifice, that the way he needed me made up for all the ways he hurt me. But something in me had shifted. The moment I saw that message, the moment I opened my phone and felt my stomach drop, the moment I saw the picture of him with her, the moment everything I had refused to believe became undeniable, I felt it snap. That invisible thread I had been holding on to, the one that kept me tethered to him, the one that had convinced me it was my responsibility to save him from himself, to love him through every lie, every disappearance, every drunken confession of regret. It snapped, and I felt it go so suddenly, so violently, that I was left standing in the wreckage of it, unable to feel anything but the cold, numbing realization that I didn't care anymore. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" My voice barely sounded like my own. He stepped forward, his hands reaching for me like they always did when he needed to pull me back in, but I moved before he could touch me. "Baby, please." It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I let out a quiet, bitter laugh, shaking my head, but I still wasn't angry. I should have been, but there was no room for anger when exhaustion had taken up every inch of space inside me. I was so unbelievably, devastatingly tired. Tired of the late nights spent waiting for him to come home. Tired of the excuses, the apologies, the empty promises. Tired of trying to hold together something that had been breaking for so long. There was barely anything left to hold. "You always say that," I murmured. "You always say it didn't mean anything." "Because it doesn't." His voice cracked, thick with desperation, with panic, with the familiar fear that set in whenever he realized I might actually leave. "I love you. You're the only one that matters, I swear to God. Just let me explain." "Explain what?" My voice wasn't raised, wasn't trembling, wasn't full of rage the way it should have been. "Explain why you lied to my face? Explain why you've been sneaking around behind my back? Explain why I've spent years fighting for us when you were never fighting for me." His lips parted, but no sound came out. That was the thing about him. He always had an excuse. He always had a way to twist the truth into something softer, something easier to swallow, something that made me feel like I was the unreasonable one for not believing him. And I had fallen for it every time. I had let him convince me that love was messy, that commitment meant forgiveness, that he was just lost and I was the only one who could bring him back. I had let guilt sink its claws into me, dig so deep that it became part of my identity. Because I was the one who had convinced him to stay that night, years ago, when he wanted to give up on everything. I was the one who held his shaking hands, who promised I wouldn't let him fall, who made it my responsibility to keep him safe, to keep him breathing, to keep him alive. And so I did. Through every mistake, every heartbreak, every betrayal, I stayed. Because I thought leaving meant failing him. Because I thought leaving meant I had wasted all those years trying to fix something that could never be fixed. But standing here, looking at him now, I finally understood. I wasn't saving him. I was losing myself. And I couldn't do it anymore. I inhaled sharply, bracing myself against the weight of it, against the finality of what I was about to say. "I can't do this anymore." His face crumpled. "Don't say that." But I had to. I had to say it, and I had to mean it, and I had to follow through, because if I didn't, I would end up right back where I started. And I couldn't survive that again. "You always say you love me," I whispered. "But love isn't supposed to feel like this." His breathing was ragged, his fingers twitching at his sides like he wanted to reach for me, like he wanted to shake me until I went back to being the girl who would forgive him, who would fall apart at the thought of losing him. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "Please," he begged, and for the first time I didn't feel anything at all. "Not this time," I said. His eyes flashed, his desperation turning sharp, angry, because he could feel it too. He could feel me slipping away. "After everything we've been through, you're just going to walk away?" I let out a slow, measured breath. "After everything, I'm finally choosing myself." And then I turned, walked toward the bedroom, and closed the door behind me. This was the part where I was supposed to cry, wasn't it? This was the part where I was supposed to collapse onto the bed, sobbing into the pillows, mourning the love I had lost. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at the walls, feeling the silence settle around me, feeling the weight of what I had done press against my chest, feeling the strangest, most unexpected emotion of all. Relief. Because for the first time in years, I was free. I expected him to follow me. I expected him to slam his fists against the door, to demand that I open it, to beg me to listen, to make excuses, to twist the truth into something that didn't feel so damning. But the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he was waiting for me to come back out, if he still believed that I would. Maybe he was standing on the other side, pacing, running through the script he always used, the one where he broke just enough to make me feel like I was abandoning him. But I wasn't. Not this time. I sat down on the bed, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress, my body stiff with the weight of everything I had just done. It was strange how quiet it felt inside me. No anger, no heartbreak, just the realization that I had spent years bracing for this moment, and now that it was here, I didn't know what to do next. I had never planned for after. I had never allowed myself to believe there would be an after. I reached for my phone, my fingers tightening around it, my pulse hammering against my skin. My first instinct was to call someone, to tell someone, to let someone else confirm that I had done the right thing. But who? The few friends I had left had grown tired of the cycle a long time ago. They had stopped asking me if I was okay, stopped waiting for me to wake up and see him for what he was. The last time I had mentioned leaving, months ago, I had seen it in their faces, the exhaustion, the quiet resignation, the knowledge that I wasn't ready yet. They had heard this story before. I turned the phone over in my hands, staring at the screen, waiting for the flood of messages that would come. I knew how this worked. He would disappear for a while, let the silence do its job, let the guilt sink its claws into me, and then, when I was at my weakest, he would say exactly what I needed to hear. He would remind me of all the reasons I had stayed, remind me of the nights I held him when no one else would, remind me that leaving meant giving up on everything I had sacrificed for him. The air in the apartment felt too thick, pressing against my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. I needed to get out. I needed to step outside, to hear something other than the sound of my own thoughts unraveling. I moved quickly, grabbing my jacket, reaching for my bag before realizing that I had left it in the living room. My fingers hesitated on the doorknob. I knew what was waiting on the other side. Him. The mess of emotions he would be carefully curating, the performance that had worked so well in the past. But I couldn't stay in this room forever. I opened the door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. He was sitting on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked up the second he heard me, his eyes red, his expression torn between shame and defiance. "Where are you going?" His voice was rough, thick with something that might have been real if I hadn't seen him play this part so many times before. I didn't answer, moving toward the small table by the door, grabbing my bag. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, flat and cold, like he had already decided what it meant. "You're just going to walk out like I don't even deserve a chance to explain?" I turned to look at him, at the man I had spent years trying to save, and for the first time, I saw him for exactly who he was. Not the broken boy who needed me. Not the man I had convinced myself he could be. Just someone who would never change, no matter how much I tried to fix him. You've had enough chances. My voice was steady, even though my hands were shaking. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. So that's it? You're done? After everything? After everything. The words echoed, but they didn't hit the way he wanted them to. I nodded. Something in his face shifted, something darker, something colder. You can't just walk away from this. From us. There it was. The turn. The moment he realized that the tears and the guilt weren't going to work this time. Watch me. His jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. You think you're the victim here? His voice was lower now, sharp and cutting, a complete departure from the desperation he had shown minutes ago. You think you're innocent? You're not. You never were. I could feel it then, the shift in the air, the last attempt to make me stay, not by pulling me in, but by dragging me down with him. You want to talk about lies? He stood up, stepping closer, his eyes searching mine for any sign of weakness. Let's talk about that night. Let's talk about how you made me stay. How you convinced me that my life was worth something when you had no idea what the hell you were talking about. His voice was filled with something venomous now, something laced with accusation. You don't get to act like you're some kind of saint. You did this to me. You made me believe in something I never should have. And now what? Now you're leaving. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to decide when it ends. For the first time that night, I felt the anger rise. I felt it crack through the numbness, burn through the exhaustion, fill every empty space he had left inside me. I made you stay, I repeated, my voice shaking. I saved your life, and you're using that against me? He scoffed, crossing his arms, his lips curling into something that made my stomach turn. You didn't save me. You trapped me. The words hit harder than I wanted them to. He saw it. He knew exactly where to aim, exactly how to make me doubt myself, exactly how to make me question if I was the one who had ruined everything. And for a split second, I almost let him. But then I remembered the messages. The late nights alone. The constant weight of waiting for him to love me the way I had loved him. The exhaustion. The betrayal. The fact that, for the first time in years, I didn't want to save him. I wanted to save myself. You can keep telling yourself that, I said, gripping the strap of my bag. But you and I both know the truth. I didn't trap you. I just let you ruin me. His face twisted, but I didn't wait for whatever came next. I turned, opened the door, and stepped into the night, breathing in the cold air like it was the first time I had ever really breathed. I expected him to follow. I expected him to yell. I expected him to fight for me in the way he never had before. But the door stayed closed behind me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I thought leaving would feel like freedom, like stepping into a world that was finally mine again. But the second the cold air hit my face, doubt crept in. My hands were gripping the strap of my bag too tightly, my steps too rushed, too unsteady, like I needed to outrun something I couldn't name. I could still hear his voice in my head, sharp and cutting, twisting the past into something unrecognizable, making me wonder if I had been the one who had done the damage all along. You didn't save me. You trapped me. The words followed me down the stairs, out onto the sidewalk, sinking their claws into my skin as I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. I reached the end of the block before my phone buzzed in my pocket. I shouldn't have looked. I should have kept walking, kept moving forward, but I had spent so many years waiting for his words, searching for them, hoping that this time, they would be different. My fingers hesitated before pulling out the phone, before glancing down at the screen, before seeing his name where it had always been. One message. Just his name. No apology, no explanation, no desperate plea to come back. Just him, reminding me that he was still there, that I would never be able to just erase him, that he would always find a way to pull me back. I wanted to delete it. I wanted to shut off my phone and throw it into the street and never look at it again, but I couldn't. I hated that part of myself, the part that still wanted something from him, the part that still wanted to be needed, to be wanted, to be fought for. He had spent years making sure I never walked away completely. I had spent years convincing myself I never would. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and kept walking, forcing myself to ignore the way my heart pounded in my chest. I needed to think. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't just empty streets and cold air and the sound of my own footsteps. I reached the main road and flagged down the first cab I saw, sliding into the back seat, giving the driver an address before I could second-guess myself. The apartment felt too bright when I stepped inside, the overhead lights casting everything in a harsh glow. The air smelled like lavender and something warm, familiar, something that reminded me of nights that had felt safer, quieter, before everything had started to unravel. She was already watching me from across the room, her expression unreadable, her fingers curled around the mug of tea she had probably made hours ago. "You left." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a fact, something she had been waiting to hear for too long. I nodded, dropping my bag by the door, swallowing against the pressure building in my throat. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was here, why I had called, why I had shown up after months of silence. She just set her mug down on the coffee table, leaned forward, and held out her hands, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself take them. Her fingers tightened around mine, steady and warm, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "Are you okay?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her I had never been more sure of anything in my life, that leaving was the easiest thing I had ever done, that I felt light and unburdened and ready to move forward. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, because they weren't true. "I don't know." My voice was quiet, almost too quiet, but she heard me. She squeezed my hands once before letting go, standing up, moving toward the kitchen like she already knew what I needed. A moment. Space. Something warm in my hands to keep me from falling apart. I had spent so much time pretending I was fine, convincing myself that as long as I could hold everything together, no one would have to know how close I had been to breaking. I had pushed everyone away, convinced myself I was alone, that no one wanted to hear about the mess I had made of my own life. But now, sitting here, in an apartment that didn't feel like a trap, with someone who wasn't waiting for me to explain myself, I realized how much I had needed this. She came back with 2 mugs, setting one in front of me before sitting down again, curling her legs beneath her, watching me without pressing, without demanding anything. "Did he try to stop you?" I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my skin, trying to ignore the way my throat tightened. "No." She studied me for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out whether that was a good thing or not. I didn't even know the answer myself. "Did you want him to?" I exhaled slowly, staring down at the tea, watching the steam curl into the air. "I don't know." She didn't look surprised. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to feel the kind of rage that would make this easier, that would make me forget how much I had loved him, how much of myself I had poured into him, how much I had sacrificed to keep him standing. But all I felt was empty. Like I had given everything I had and there was nothing left. I wasted so much time. The words slipped out before I could stop them. She shook her head. "You learned. That's not wasting." I wanted to believe her. She set her mug down, pulling her legs up to her chest, resting her chin on her knees. "Do you think you're going to go back?" The question made my stomach twist, because it wasn't just about what I thought. It was about what I had done in the past, about all the times I had sworn I was done, only to find myself right back where I started. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to let him pull me in again. I didn't want to be the person who forgave him just because it was easier than being alone. But I knew how this worked. He wasn't going to let me go that easily. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, staring at the screen, at the one unread message, at the name that had been in my life for too long. She followed my gaze, exhaling through her nose, like she already knew what I was thinking. "What did he say?" "Nothing. Just his name." Her expression darkened. "He's testing you. Seeing if you'll open the door." I looked up at her, searching for something, for certainty, for conviction, for proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling like I was still caught in his grip, even after I had walked away. "I don't want to go back." "Then don't." I wished it were that easy. The message sat there, taunting me. His name, Nothing more, no words, no explanations, just a presence, a reminder that he still existed, that he still had access to me, that all it took was 1 second of weakness for me to let him back in. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for a moment, I could feel it, how easy it would be to open the message, to invite the conversation, to give him the opportunity to twist this into something I would regret later. It was muscle memory, the way I always gave in, the way I always found a reason to believe him. I wasn't sure who I hated more in that moment, him for doing this or myself for letting it get this far. I locked the phone and shoved it deep into my bag, pressing my hands against my temples, trying to force my brain to stop cycling through all the ways this could go. I could block him. I could change my number. I could erase him from my life in a single move, and yet I hesitated. It wasn't about missing him. I didn't. It wasn't about wanting to go back. I knew I couldn't. It was about the hold he still had, the years of conditioning that made me feel like if I cut him off completely, I was doing something cruel. He had spent so long making sure I felt like I was responsible for him, and even now, after everything, some part of me was still carrying that weight. She was watching me from across the room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, just waiting, just letting me sit in the discomfort of my own indecision. But I could feel her judgment, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She had seen this happen before. She had watched me pick up the phone, let him back in, convince myself that this time was different. She wasn't going to tell me what to do. She had learned that telling me never worked. I don't know why it's so hard, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Because he made it that way. Her tone was calm, even, like she had already figured out the answer long before I had. He made sure you would never leave completely. That's the whole point. I swallowed, hating that she was right, hating that I had let it get to this point. You don't owe him anything. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent years believing the opposite, believing that because I had been there when no one else was, because I had held him up when he was falling apart, because I had promised not to give up on him, I was bound to this, to him. To the obligation of seeing it through. But she was right. I didn't owe him anything. The realization was almost too much. I stood up suddenly, pacing toward the kitchen, opening cabinets, closing them, pretending I was looking for something when really I was just trying to find a way to keep myself from unraveling. The weight of it all was pressing down too hard, suffocating me, making it impossible to think straight. I felt like if I didn't move, I was going to break. She didn't move from her spot on the couch. Are you going to answer him? I gritted my teeth. No. Are you going to block him? I hesitated, gripping the counter, my nails digging into the surface. I don't know. She exhaled, and I could hear the frustration in it, but she didn't push, didn't tell me what I already knew, didn't try to convince me of something I needed to decide for myself. Instead, she just stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the door. Come on. I frowned, turning to look at her. Where are we going? Somewhere that isn't here. I wanted to argue, to tell her I wasn't in the mood to go anywhere, that I just needed time to think, but I was tired of thinking. Thinking was what had kept me trapped for so long, analyzing, overanalyzing, trying to make sense of something that had never made sense, trying to justify something that had never been justifiable. I didn't need to think. I needed to move. I grabbed my coat and followed her out the door. The air outside was sharp and cold, but it helped cut through the fog in my brain, forced me to focus on something that wasn't the voice in my head telling me to check my phone. We walked without speaking, past empty streets, past glowing storefronts, past people who had no idea that my entire life had just changed, that I was standing in the aftermath of something that should have broken me, but somehow hadn't. She didn't tell me where we were going. She just kept walking, her pace steady, her hands shoved into her pockets, like she knew I needed this more than I did. We ended up at a coffee shop, one of the old ones we used to go to, before he had taken up every inch of my time, before I had let my world shrink to fit inside his. She ordered for both of us without asking, slid a cup across the table, sat down, and waited. I stared at the steam rising from the cup, at the normalcy of it, at the strange comfort of sitting across from someone who didn't expect me to say anything. I don't know who I am without him. The confession slipped out before I could stop it. She didn't look surprised. That's what he wanted. I swallowed hard, gripping the cup, trying to process the weight of that, the truth of it, the years I had spent molding myself into what he needed, the way I had let myself disappear in the process. I don't want to be that person anymore. Then don't be. It sounded so simple, like it was just a choice, like all I had to do was wake up tomorrow and decide to be someone different, but I knew it wasn't that easy. He had spent years making sure I wouldn't know how to exist without him. I had spent years letting him. But I had left. That had to mean something. She leaned back in her chair, watching me carefully. You know he's not going to stop. I knew. Of course I knew. This wasn't over. The message was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let me go without a fight, wasn't going to let me slip through his fingers so easily. He was waiting for me to cave, waiting for me to give him an opening. He was patient. He knew how to break me down. But he had underestimated me. I reached for my phone, unlocked it, stared at his name one last time before pressing down on the screen. Blocked. She didn't say anything, but I could see the relief in her face. I exhaled, set the phone down, and finally took a sip of my coffee. It was hot. Strong. Bitter. It burned, but I didn't mind. I welcomed it. I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was slow, deliberate, not the kind of knocking that came from a delivery or a neighbor, but from someone who wanted to be heard. My body stiffened before I was even fully awake, my mind catching up too fast, realizing what I already knew deep down. It was him. I pushed the blanket off and sat up, the room unfamiliar in the early morning light. The apartment smelled like coffee and clean laundry, like a place that wasn't haunted by him, like a space that wasn't filled with the weight of everything I had been carrying for years. I had slept on the couch, too wired to take the bed she had offered, too caught in the aftermath of everything to let myself fully rest. My head was pounding, my body sore from exhaustion, my stomach twisted in a way that told me I hadn't eaten in too long. But none of it mattered, because the knocking hadn't stopped. I turned my head toward the door, my pulse picking up speed, waiting, hoping it was just my imagination. It wasn't. The next knock came sharper, harder, just a little louder than the one before, like he was daring me to ignore it, like he knew I was awake and refusing to answer. My breath caught, my muscles locking into place, because I had been here before, because I had seen this play out too many times to count. He never gave up easily. She stepped into the room before I could move, still in her oversized hoodie and sweatpants, her hair messy from sleep, but her face sharp with understanding. She knew. Of course she knew. She had been waiting for this. Stay here, she said, her voice firm, low, like she knew I wouldn't listen. I stood up before she could argue, my legs unsteady beneath me, my body moving before my brain had fully caught up. No. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't stop me as I walked past her toward the door. I could feel her eyes on my back, the silent warning, the unspoken frustration, but I had to do this myself. If I didn't, it would never end. I reached for the handle, took a breath, and pulled the door open. He was standing there, exactly like I had imagined, wearing the same expression he always wore when he was trying to fix something he had broken. He had a way of making himself look smaller, softer, even when he was the one who had done the damage, even when he was the one who had shattered everything. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, like he had thrown himself together too quickly, like he wanted me to see the state he was in, like he wanted me to feel it. But I didn't. He exhaled sharply when he saw me, his shoulders dropping like he had just confirmed something he didn't want to be true. You blocked me. I didn't answer. He took a step forward, but I didn't move. I get it, okay? I get why you're mad. I get why you left, but you can't just cut me off like that. I stared at him, waiting, wondering if he actually believed what he was saying, if he actually thought he was owed something after everything he had done. You showed up here, I said, my voice flat, empty, refusing to give him what he wanted. His lips pressed into a tight line. I had to. You wouldn't answer me. That was the point. He dragged a hand through his hair, his frustration slipping through the cracks. Come on, don't do this. Just let me talk to you. You had your chance to talk. You used it to lie to me. His face twitched, a flash of something sharp and defensive, but he caught himself before it could settle in. He exhaled, stepping back slightly, adjusting his tone, softening his posture, like he was recalibrating, like he was trying to figure out which version of himself would get the reaction he wanted. I know I messed up, okay? I know I should have told you the truth, but I didn't want to lose you. You lost me the second you chose her. His mouth opened, but for the first time, there was nothing behind it. I felt her presence behind me before she spoke, her voice cutting through the air, calm but firm. You need to leave. He blinked, looking past me, his expression shifting, closing off, like he had just remembered she existed, like he had thought he could control the situation until now. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Right. Of course. You run to her, and suddenly I'm the bad guy. You were always the bad guy, she said, unmoved. He turned back to me, his face unreadable now, his voice lower, colder. This isn't over. A shiver ran down my spine, but I held my ground, forcing my hands to stay at my sides, refusing to let him see the way his words still had the power to crawl under my skin. Yes, it is. His jaw tensed, his fingers twitching at his sides like he wanted to say more, like he wanted to do more, but after a long, silent moment, he stepped back. Fine. I didn't move until he was gone. The door shut, the lock clicking into place, the silence settling heavier than before. I could still feel him in the air, his words lingering, pressing down on me, trying to make me second-guess myself. I could still hear the way he had said it, like it was a threat, like he wasn't going to let me go that easily. But I had meant what I said. It was over. She exhaled beside me, rubbing a hand down her face. You okay? I nodded, even though I wasn't sure. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she turned away, heading back toward the kitchen, giving me the space to breathe, to process, to sit in the aftermath of it all. I walked back to the couch, sat down, reached for my phone, staring at the empty notifications, the blank screen, the absence of him. It was strange, the way relief and unease tangled together, the way my body still expected something that wasn't coming. But this time, when I exhaled, it felt a little easier. This time, I didn't reach for my phone to unblock him. The relief didn't last. It should have. He was gone. The door was locked. The weight of him, of his presence, of the years I had spent wrapped up in his chaos should have lifted. But instead, something else settled in, something heavier, something that made my stomach twist, something that felt too close to fear. Because I knew him. I knew what he was capable of when he felt like he was losing control. And for the first time, I had done something he hadn't expected. I had walked away. I had left him standing there without the reaction he wanted, without the comfort of knowing he could still get to me. And that wasn't something he would let go of easily. She watched me from across the room, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken concern, the quiet understanding of what came next. She had never liked him. She had tolerated him, had put up with my excuses, had waited for me to wake up, but she had never trusted him. And now, as I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of my seat, staring at the locked door like it might not be enough, I knew why. You think he's coming back, she said. I didn't answer. Because I didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to give it power, didn't want to admit that, deep down, I wasn't sure if this was really over. I had walked away, but he hadn't. And people like him didn't just let things go. She sighed, pushing away from the wall, grabbing her keys off the counter. Come on. I frowned, confused. Where are we going? You're not staying here. I wanted to argue, to tell her I was fine, that he wouldn't do anything, that I was overreacting, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't know what he would do. I had never seen him this desperate before, had never pushed him to this point, had never given him a reason to feel like he had lost control completely. And that terrified me. I grabbed my bag and followed her out the door. The drive was quiet, tense, filled with the kind of silence that didn't feel comfortable, the kind that carried too many unspoken words, too many thoughts neither of us wanted to say out loud. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was letting my paranoia get the best of me, that he wouldn't cross a line just because I had finally drawn one. But the pit in my stomach didn't ease. It only grew heavier. She pulled into the parking lot of a hotel, cutting the engine, turning to face me. Just for the night. It felt like too much, like an overreaction, like a decision that would make this whole situation feel bigger than it already was. But when I glanced at my phone, when I saw the empty screen, the silence from him that didn't feel like surrender, I nodded. The room was small, unremarkable, just a bed and a desk and a window that overlooked nothing important. But it was quiet. It was safe. And for the first time since I had walked out of that apartment, I let myself breathe. She dropped my bag on the chair by the door, pulled out her phone, checked something before glancing at me. If he shows up at my place again, I'm calling the cops. I swallowed, my throat tight. He wouldn't. She gave me a look that shut me up before I could finish. You don't know that. She was right. I didn't. She hesitated for a second, like she wanted to say more, like she wanted to push me to really think about what all of this meant, but instead, she just exhaled and reached for the door. Try to sleep. I nodded, watching as she left, listening as the door clicked shut, sealing me inside a space that should have felt like a relief, but only made me feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep. I tried. I laid down. I closed my eyes. I told myself over and over again that I was fine, that I was safe, that he wouldn't do anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that this was just the calm before the storm, that I had spent years convincing myself I understood him when, really, I had no idea what he was capable of when he felt like he had nothing left to lose. The knock on the door made my entire body go still. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a sharp jolt through me, every nerve in my body going rigid, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just stared at the door, waiting, listening, hoping, praying that it was nothing, that it was a mistake, that it wasn't him. Another knock. A voice. Not his. Front desk. Ma'am, I have a message for you. I exhaled sharply, pushing myself upright, my pulse still racing as I moved toward the door. I hesitated for half a second before unlocking it, opening it just enough to see the man standing on the other side, wearing a uniform, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. This was left for you at the desk, he said, passing it through the gap. I took it, my fingers shaking slightly, my stomach twisting, my breath catching in my throat as I unfolded the note. I told you this wasn't over. The floor felt like it dropped beneath me. I looked up, my vision blurring for a second, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The man was already turning to leave, already walking down the hall, already disappearing before I could find my voice. I looked back down at the note, at the words scrawled across the paper in handwriting I knew too well, at the proof that I had been right, that he hadn't let go, that I had done what he never thought I would do, made him desperate. I stumbled back into the room, shut the door, locked it, checked it twice, my breathing coming too fast, my hands shaking too much. I pulled out my phone, my fingers clumsy as I dialed. It rang twice before she picked up. What's wrong? He found me. The silence on the other end was too heavy, too sharp, too much. Then her voice, steady, certain, filled with something I hadn't heard in a long time. Call the police. I didn't call the police. I should have. I knew that. It was the logical thing to do, the smart thing to do, the thing that any reasonable person would do. But logic didn't matter when fear had its hands wrapped around your throat, when every decision you made felt like stepping onto unstable ground, when you had spent years convincing yourself that the person you once loved wasn't capable of real harm. Calling the police meant admitting I was afraid of him. It meant escalating this into something that couldn't be undone. And, even after everything, some part of me still hesitated. She didn't. The moment she arrived, she took one look at me, at the note clutched in my hand, at the way I had checked the lock 3 times in the last minute, and pulled out her phone. I grabbed her wrist before she could dial. Wait. Her eyes flashed with something sharp, something close to anger, but she didn't pull away. Wait for what? I swallowed hard, my thoughts spinning too fast, my stomach tight with something that felt dangerously close to guilt. I need to think. She yanked her hand free, stepping back, her expression unreadable, but her frustration thick in the air. Think about what? How much more proof do you need? He found you. He's playing with you. Do you really want to see what happens when he stops playing? My chest ached, my breath coming too shallow, my hands still trembling from the shock of it all. I didn't want to see what happened next. I didn't want to wait and find out if this was just another one of his mind games, or if this was the moment he finally snapped. But I had spent so long making excuses for him that breaking the habit felt impossible. I looked at her, trying to find the right words, trying to make her understand the war happening inside my head, but she wasn't interested in my justifications anymore. You're scared, she said, quieter now, but no less firm. That's enough of a reason. The truth of it was suffocating. She exhaled sharply, gripping the back of her neck, pacing once before stopping in front of me again. Okay, if you won't call them, I will. Panic shot through me, irrational but immediate. No. Then do it yourself. I hesitated, and that was all she needed to see. Her jaw clenched, disappointment flashing across her face before she turned away, pacing toward the window, arms crossed so tightly over her chest it looked painful. You know what's going to happen, don't you? If you don't stop this now, he's not going to wake up tomorrow and decide to move on. This isn't going away. He's testing you, seeing how far he can push, seeing what you'll let him get away with. And right now, you're proving that he can still control you. I hated how much it stung. I dropped onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, my body shaking from the weight of it all. I don't know how to do this. You don't have to, she shot back, spinning to face me again. That's what they're for. She gestured toward my phone, her meaning clear. But you have to make the choice. I can't do it for you. The worst part was I knew she was right. I had known it the second I saw the note. Maybe even before that. The moment I walked away, the moment I stopped playing by his rules, the moment I decided to choose myself over him, he had made the decision for me. I had been trying to convince myself that I was the one in control, that I could handle this, that he wouldn't actually cross the line, but he already had. He had found me. He had sent a message, not just with words, but with the act itself. He was reminding me that I would never be out of his reach. And if I didn't do something now, I never would be. I grabbed my phone with fingers that still felt unsteady, pulled up the keypad, and pressed the numbers before I could change my mind. Her expression didn't shift, but I saw the tension ease in her shoulders as I lifted the phone to my ear. The dispatcher answered, their voice calm, professional, steady in a way that made me feel even more out of control. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak, to push the words out past the lump in my throat. Hi, I need to report something. They asked me for my name, my location, the nature of my call. I answered each question on autopilot, my voice too tight, too high, betraying how much this was affecting me. And then they asked the one question I hadn't prepared for. Do you feel like you're in immediate danger? I hesitated. She made a sound of frustration from across the room, but she didn't interrupt. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the phone tighter. I don't know. The dispatcher's tone didn't change. Has this person threatened you directly? I thought about the note, about the way he had stood outside my door this morning, about all the things he had never said out loud, but had made sure I understood anyway. Not in words, I admitted, my stomach twisting. Has he ever hurt you before? I sucked in a sharp breath, my fingers tightening around the phone. No, not physically. The silence stretched for half a second too long before the dispatcher spoke again. Are you worried he might? I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to say it out loud, to make it real, to acknowledge the truth that had been sitting in the back of my mind for far too long. But the moment I didn't answer, I knew. I wasn't just worried. I was terrified. Yes. The word was barely a whisper, but it felt like a scream. The dispatcher's tone softened, but their professionalism didn't waver. We're sending someone out now. Stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone until the officers arrive. I nodded even though they couldn't see me. Okay. When I ended the call, my hand was shaking so badly I had to set the phone down before I dropped it. She was still standing there, watching me, waiting. But she didn't say I told you so. She didn't say anything. She just walked over, sat down next to me, and waited. We didn't talk as we listened for the sound of sirens. We didn't talk as the weight of what I had just done settled in. We didn't talk as I realized that, for the first time, I had finally stopped saving him. This time, I was saving myself. The knock on the door sent a jolt through my entire body. It was too soon. The police couldn't have arrived that fast. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears as I shot a look toward her. She was already on her feet, moving toward the window, her jaw tight, her body tense like she was ready to fight something off if she had to. I forced myself to move, to stand, to breathe through the fear pressing against my chest as I reached for my phone. But before I could dial again, a voice called out from the other side of the door. Police. I let out a shaky breath, but I didn't move. She didn't either. Can you confirm? She called out, her voice steady in a way mine wasn't. A brief pause, then a second knock. This is Officer Beck, responding to a call from this room. Can you open the door? She moved before I could, unlocking the deadbolt, stepping aside just enough to let them in. Two officers stood in the doorway, a man and a woman, both in uniform, both scanning the room with sharp, practiced eyes. I saw the moment they assessed me, saw the way their expressions shifted, the way they took in the tension in my shoulders, the way I was gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The male officer, Beck, I assumed, spoke first. We received a report that someone was harassing you. Can you tell us what happened? I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to find my voice, but before I could answer, the female officer stepped forward slightly, her expression softer. Do you feel safe right now? I hesitated. Her gaze didn't waver. If the answer isn't yes, that's okay. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to say it out loud. No, I don't. The moment the words left my mouth, everything felt more real. The past few hours had been a blur of panic and second-guessing, of trying to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe he wouldn't actually do anything, that maybe I had blown this out of proportion. But I hadn't. The note in my bag, the way he had found me, the way my entire body had gone rigid the second I heard a knock at the door, it was all proof. I sat down on the edge of the bed as they started asking questions. His name, my name, how long we had been together, what had led up to this, if there had ever been physical violence. The answers spilled out of me in pieces, in short, clipped explanations that felt too small to hold the weight of what I had been through. No, he had never hit me. No, he had never threatened to kill me. But he had controlled me. He had manipulated me. He had worn me down to the point where I didn't know who I was without him. And now, after finally breaking free, he wasn't letting go. Officer Beck took notes, his expression unreadable, but the female officer, Lewis, her badge red, watched me closely, listening in a way that made me feel like she understood something deeper, something that went beyond what I was saying out loud. Do you want to press charges? The question hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time trying to escape him that I hadn't even considered what came next. I thought leaving would be enough. I thought blocking him, cutting him off, walking away would be the end of it. But now, sitting here, realizing that he wasn't just going to let me go, I understood something I had been trying to ignore. If I didn't stop him now, he would keep coming. He would keep pushing. He would find another way. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself to think past the fear, past the guilt, past the years of convincing myself that protecting him was the same as protecting myself. He had made his choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. Yes. Officer Beck nodded, writing something down, while Officer Lewis spoke again. We can help you file a restraining order. It won't stop him from trying, but it will give us something to act on if he doesn't back off. I nodded, my throat tight. Okay. We'll also need to know where he lives, where he works, any places he might go looking for you, Beck added. If he's been tracking you, if he's used any of your accounts, if you think he might still have access to anything, we need to shut it down now. I swallowed hard, the reality of it all slamming into me at once. This wasn't just leaving anymore. This was war. She sat next to me, her presence solid, unwavering, the only familiar thing in a night that had spiraled completely out of my control. I wasn't used to this kind of help. I wasn't used to people taking my side without question. But she wasn't leaving, and neither were they. Officer Lewis pulled out a card, writing something on the back before handing it to me. This is my personal number. If he contacts you, if he shows up, if anything feels off, you call me. No second guessing. No waiting. I stared at the card, my fingers shaking as I took it. She met my eyes. You did the right thing. The words almost broke me. Beck stepped toward the door. We're going to do a sweep of the hotel, make sure he's not lurking around. Stay put until we get back. They left, the door clicking shut behind them, and for the first time in hours, I felt the tiniest sliver of something close to safe. But it wasn't over. I knew that. This was just the beginning of something I had spent years trying to avoid. She turned to me, her voice softer now. You okay? I let out a slow breath, gripping the card tighter, letting the reality of it all settle in. Yeah, I said, and for the first time, I almost believed it. You don't owe anyone your suffering. Choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival.